Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that feels, I don't know, almost too familiar. And I've found that's usually the most dangerous kind of topic.
Because you think you know the story.
Exactly. We think we know it, so we stop asking questions. We are talking, of course, about the Declaration of Independence.
The document that started it all, or, well, maybe the document that explained it all.
Right. And usually when we talk about this, our minds go straight to, fireworks, barbecues, the date on the calendar. But as I was going through the stack of research you sent, the National Archives docs, the analysis from the Independence Institute, it just hit me that we aren't looking at a history lesson here. We're
No,
looking at the installation of a moral operating system.
that is the perfect way to frame it. It wasn't just a breakup letter to King George, although it was definitely that. It was a philosophical argument that, it basically changed the software of the Western world.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's an argument we're still having with ourselves today.
So the mission for this deep dive is to get past the fancy parchment and the signatures and figure out what this document actually did to the human mind. And I want to jump right in with something that honestly blew my mind,
Okay.
which is that if we were being totally historically accurate, we shouldn't be celebrating on July 4th at all.
No, we really missed the party by 2 days.
It should be July 2nd.
July 2nd, 1776. That was the day the Continental Congress actually voted on the Lee Resolution. That was the legal act. The ties were officially cut on the 2nd.
So that was it. Independence.
That was it. John Adams was so sure that July 2nd would be the big day that he wrote to his wife, Abigail, and he predicted it would be the great anniversary festival. He was talking about bonfires and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other.
Poor Adams. He missed it by 48 hours. So why did the 4th win out?
Because July 2nd was just the act. July 4th was the explanation. That was the day they approved the text that Jefferson had drafted to tell the world why they were doing this. And it turns out history cares a lot more about the why than the legal procedure.
That makes a lot of sense. The vote is just procedure. The declaration is the soul of the thing.
Exactly. And that soul is what we need to unpack. Because when you read the preamble today, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It just flows so smoothly. It feels inevitable.
Yeah.
But if you look at the analysis from the Independence Institute, there's a ton of philosophical weight in those words that we might miss with modern ears. Specifically, the whole concept of a right.
This stood out to me in the reading. Today, when I say I have a right to free speech, I usually mean the government can't stop me from talking. It's like a shield, an immunity.
Correct. We see it as freedom from interference. But to the founders, back in the 18th century, the word right had a much more muscular meaning. It often meant a power, a prerogative to act. It wasn't passive, it was active.
So not just leave me alone, but I have the power to do this.
Yes. They were drawing heavily on John Locke and this idea of natural rights. The theory is that in a state of nature, before there were any kings or governments, every person had basically limitless rights, the power to do whatever you were capable of.
Total freedom, but I imagine it was also pretty chaotic.
Very chaotic and dangerous. So the theory goes, people enter into a social contract. They voluntarily give up some of those powers, some of those rights to a government. And in exchange, the government protects the rights they decided to keep.
Okay, so I give up my right to be my own judge and jury, and in exchange, the government protects my life and my property.
Precisely. It's a transaction. But, and this is the absolute core of the Declaration, you never, ever surrender the unalienable rights. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, those don't come from the government.
They're just inherent.
They're inherent. The government's only legitimate job is to secure them.
And if the government starts messing with those unalienable rights,
The deal's off. The contract is broken. And that brings us to the most radical idea in the entire document, the right of revolution. It says right there, when government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it.
which is a terrifying thing for a government to admit. Here's the paperwork that says you can fire us or, overthrow us if we mess this up.
It's basically a suicide pact for tyranny. It gives explicit permission for the destruction of the state if the state fails its people.
Wow. Now, before we move on from the preamble, there's this little editing detail I love. The original draft didn't say self-evident.
No, it didn't. Thomas Jefferson's first draft called these truths sacred and undeniable.
Sacred and undeniable. That sounds very religious.
It does. It sounds like something from a catechism, but the final version, and this was likely Benjamin Franklin's influence, changed it to self-evident.
Which feels more like science, an axiom in geometry or something.
Exactly. Franklin was a man of the Enlightenment, a scientist. To say something is self-evident means it's just a fact of reality. You don't need faith to believe 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you don't need faith to believe all men are created equal. It just is.
It shifted the whole argument from divine revelation to uh, rational reason.
It did, a very subtle but brilliant change.
Okay, so we have this beautiful, rational, philosophical engine powering the new country. All men are created equal. But we have to talk about the elephant in the room.
The great contradiction.
The men signing this document, many of them, Jefferson included, owned enslaved people. How do you square that circle? Do they just not notice?
Oh, they notice. And this is one of the most dramatic parts of the story that often gets left out. In Jefferson's original rough draft, the one he showed to Congress before they took a red pen to it, there was a scathing condemnation of slavery.
Wait, really? In the Declaration of Independence?
Yes. It was listed as one of the grievances against King George. Jefferson wrote that the king had waged cruel war against human nature itself by captivating and carrying people into slavery. He called the slave trade piratical warfare and an assemblage of horrors.
Wow. That is incredibly strong language, especially coming from him.
It's deeply complicated. He was trying to thread a very, very difficult needle there. He was blaming the king for forcing the slave trade on the colonies.
Which sounds a little bit like passing the buck. He made us do it.
Oh, it was absolutely a convenient political argument, but it was also a moral stance. He called it an execrable commerce. But here's what happened. That whole passage didn't make the final cut.
Who cut it?
Congress did. Specifically, the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies were, completely dependent on slavery. But it was also some of the northern merchants who were making a lot of money from the slave trade itself. They looked at that passage and basically said, if this stays in, we're out.
So it was a compromise to keep everyone on board.
It was a bargain. To get the unity they needed for independence, they had to delete the critique of slavery. They sacrificed moral consistency for political survival.
And people at the time noticed this hypocrisy, right? It wasn't just us looking back with 21st century eyes.
Oh, instantly. There was an English abolitionist, Thomas Day. He read the Declaration in 1776 and wrote this absolutely biting response. He said, "If there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot, signing resolutions of independency with the one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves."
Oof, that stings.
It does. And it set up this fundamental tension that would literally tear the country apart about 80 years later. Because the document said one thing, but the reality was something else entirely.
And that leads us perfectly into how the document was interpreted later.
Correct.
Because if you have that contradiction baked in from the start, you have to decide, was the Declaration a lie or was it a promise?
That is the central question of American history, really. And you see this battle play out so clearly in 1858 in the debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
Okay, let's set the stage. This is just before the Civil War. The country is a powder keg. What was Douglas's take on the Declaration?
Stephen Douglas was, well, a pragmatist, but in a very cynical way. He argued that when the founders said all men, they didn't literally mean all men. He said they were speaking specifically and only about white men of European descent. For him, the document was just a practical tool for 1776.
So he was basically saying, let's shrink the meaning to fit the ugly reality of the time.
Exactly. There was even a senator from Indiana, John Pettit, who went even further. He called all men are created equal a self-evident lie.
A self-evident lie.
Wow. But then you have Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln took a completely different approach. He acknowledged, yes, of course, in 1776, men were not equal in reality. But he argued the founders knew that.
So he saw them as writing for the future.
Yes. Lincoln called the Declaration a standard maxim for a free society. He said it was something to be constantly approximated and constantly labored for. In Lincoln's view, the Declaration wasn't describing the world as it was in 1776. It was describing the world as it should be. It was a moral compass for the future.
I love that distinction.
Yes.
It totally reframes the document from being a hypocritical description of the past to being a promise, a mission statement for the future.
And that interpretation, Lincoln's interpretation, is what allowed the Declaration to become a weapon.
A weapon?
A weapon for change. Once you write down all men are created equal and consent of the governed, you've given every marginalized group the language to demand their own rights. You can't unring that bell.
And we see that with the women's suffrage movement.
Seneca Falls, 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the suffragists, they took the original preamble and just added 2 words. All men and women are created equal.
Such a simple edit, but it changes everything.
And then you have John Brown.
The abolitionist who raided Harper's Ferry.
The very same. Before that raid in 1859, he wrote his own Declaration of Liberty. He copied the 1776 text almost word for word, but he repurposed it. He turned it into a declaration of war against the slave power. He used the founders' own logic, the right to revolt, to justify armed insurrection.
He was taking the right of revolution to its most literal conclusion.
He was. And it shows the sheer power of the philosophy. If that philosophy is true, then John Brown was just doing what George Washington had done.
And this thread just keeps going.
Right.
Like, I'm thinking of Martin Luther King Jr.
Absolutely. The I Have a Dream speech is just steeped in the Declaration. King called it a creed, and a promissory note that had come back marked insufficient funds for Black Americans. He wasn't rejecting the Declaration, he was demanding the nation finally live up to it.
And even later, Harvey Milk in the 70s.
Right. Harvey Milk, fighting for gay rights, said, "No matter how hard you try, you cannot erase those words from the Declaration of Independence." That's the legacy. The words themselves became bigger than the men who wrote them. They became the standard you could use to hold the country accountable.
It's wild to think that a document written to separate from a country became the moral glue holding the arguments within the country together.
Yeah.
But this didn't just stay in the U.S., did it? This was a global export.
A massive export. The Declaration of Independence basically invented a whole new genre of political writing. Before 1776, if you wanted to rebel, you just, you listed your complaints. You didn't usually lay out a universal philosophy of human rights first.
And the French were the first to run with it.
Yes, and there's a very direct connection. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris during the French Revolution. He actually helped the Marquis de Lafayette draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. You can hear the American echoes all through it.
That must have been a heady time for Jefferson, helping kick off revolutions on 2 different continents.
And it just kept spreading. Venezuela in 1811, even Vietnam in 1945. Ho Chi Minh actually quoted the American Declaration of Independence in his proclamation of independence from France.
Wait, Ho Chi Minh quoted Thomas Jefferson?
He did. All men are created equal. He used America's own moral language against a Western colonial power. But, and here is a really fascinating twist, not everyone who copied the format also copied the soul.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you look at Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, in 1965. The white minority government there declared independence from Britain specifically so they could maintain apartheid. And they wrote a declaration that mimicked the structure of the U.S. one. It had the list of grievances, the formal language, all of it.
But I'm guessing they left a couple of key phrases out.
They deliberately left out all men are created equal and consent of the governed.
Of course they did.
Because those are the dangerous ideas. It proves that the real power of the document isn't in the we're leaving part. The power is in the why. The moral philosophy is the truly revolutionary part.
It really just hammers home that the Declaration isn't some dusty artifact under glass at the National Archives. Although I did read the original is fading pretty badly.
It is. The ink is barely legible. But in a way, that almost doesn't matter. The text itself is indelible in the culture.
So as we wrap this up, what's the final thought here? We have this document that establishes our rights, it justifies revolution, but it's also got this incredibly complicated history.
I think the thing to leave with is a word we kind of skipped over earlier. We talked about the right to abolish government. That's the radical part. But the Declaration also includes a sentence about prudence.
Prudence indeed will dictate
That governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes.
So don't burn the whole system down just because you're annoyed about a new tax.
Exactly. The founders were trying to balance these two massive opposing forces. On one hand, you have radical liberty, the right to blow up the system if it fails. But on the other hand, you have stability, the need for order, and the danger of chaos.
And we are still walking that same tightrope today.
We absolutely are. In today's polarized world, you see some people leaning really hard on the right to abolish side, wanting to tear down institutions. And you see others leaning just as hard on prudence, fearing that any change will lead to chaos. The genius of the Declaration, and its challenge to us, is that it demands we hold both of those ideas in our heads at the same time.
The right to revolution, but the duty of prudence. That is a heavy thought to leave us with. Something to think about next time you see the fireworks.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Go read the text yourself. It's shorter than you think. We'll see you next time.